Good afternoon, Patriots, and welcome to the 77th audio file in the audiocast series known as the Q News Patriot. I am the Q News Patriot. My name is SG Anon. Japan, JP Morgan Chase, Saudi Arabia, Caracas, Cuba, Kenya, Turkey. All of these places sound separate. All of these entities sound individualized and unique. And yet all of them and more are engaged in component parts of a much broader deep state dethroning operation that is rapidly progressing forward in real time. Happy American Independence Day to patriots in the United States and all patriots worldwide. We wage a nonviolent, peaceful, but resolute second war, a digital war for independence, not just for the independence of our nation here in the United States, but for the independence and freedom of all peoples everywhere to decide how they want to live and allow that to reflect the society that they wish to create. It's been far too long since we've had a true chance at this, and I'm excited to bring an encouraging report to each of you. Without further ado, Patriots, we have a lot to cover. Let's get right to it. Recently, we saw the U.S. Army National Guard deploy military police detachments to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. As many of you out there are aware, military police are engaged in activities such as investigation, prisoner transport, prisoner security, prisoner surveillance and supervision, and force reinforcement operations. I find it fascinating that we see a unit deployed from Pennsylvania, one of the swing states in the United States of America, from the 2020 fraudulent election. Give me a moment, come over here. Pennsylvania Guard deploying to Guantanamo Bay. More than 100 Army National Guard soldiers assigned to the 28th Military Police Company and the 165th Battalion and the 55th or 5x5 Maneuver Enhancement Brigade departed from Harrisburg Airport to mobilize to Guantanamo Bay, this back in late May. The company is augmented by soldiers from Headquarters Detachment 165th Battalion and soldiers from the 1069th Military Police Company and the 28th Infantry Division's Headquarters and Headquarters Battalion. The unit will conduct, detention operations for Guantanamo Bay to ensure the secure, humane, and orderly confinement of detainees and inmates. In other words, we are reinforcing the prisoner protection and surveillance force, in other words, the guard force down there on Guantanamo Bay, because we are expecting, or we have already accomplished, either one could be true, a large amount or a large influx of eligible inmates. Several of the soldiers mobilizing with us have been deployed to Guantanamo Bay in the past for a very similar mission, said Sergeant First Class Matt Wilson, Operations Sergeant for the 28th Military Police. The unit will benefit from experience and expertise these soldiers are able to offer. The younger ones on this mission will use the opportunity as a learning experience and an opportunity to become a better military leader. The company will complete additional training at Fort Bliss, Texas, before arriving at Guantanamo Bay and beginning their mission. Now, what is really impressive and compelling about this is we've been talking about the activities of the Army National Guard and the U.S. Domestic Protection Forces, to include the Air National Guard, SpaceForce, and others, for quite a while, and certainly over our last recent audio files. In fact, I've published documents that I can neither confirm nor deny to be true that purport to say that SpaceForce, DHS, the National Guard, JSOC, and others are engaged in a multi-angular, multi-dimensional, deep state oriented warfare campaign, which is both awakening the populations of the world, safeguarding the world from some sort of catastrophic and cataclysmic civilizational fallout, and also allowing for the environments to change where societal dimensions such as the human trafficking component or the finance component or the healthcare, wellness, and other sectors can be augmented and shifted based on their capitulation or not in the conflict. I know that's a bit of a tall setup and a little bit of a deeper context than many out there, especially if you're hearing the broadcast for the first or second time, are going to be familiar with. But let's talk a little bit about the behavior of the National Guard. We've seen the National Guard in recent months attempting to incorporate components from the Air National Guard, many of whom were engaged out of several swing states meaning reference to the 2020 general election, where we saw the steal occur. Many of those National Guard components are essentially being requested by the Space Force, or excuse me, by the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, to move under the command of the Space Force, bypassing their governors. On May the 23rd, we saw Space Force open up applications for Air Force reservists to come in as full-time Space Force guardians. Taken out of Arlington from the Secretary for the Air Force Public Affairs, Air Force reservists in space-related career fields interested in volunteering for the U.S. Space Force in a full-time capacity. In other words, we need a full-time reservist to come back to active or semi-active duty. Can expect the application window to open June 1st through November 30th. In other words, this is the same period where we expect escalation from North Korea onto the South Korean side of the peninsula. This is the same period where we will see the Parisian Olympics. We're currently in that period now. This is the same period where we're expecting to see tremendous geopolitical shifts, which would seek to disrupt or certainly obfuscate the process towards the 2024 presidential election here in the United States. And the application window closes a mere 25 days after the date of that election. This transfer option is part of Space Force Personnel Management Act approved by Congress and signed into law as part of the FY24 National Defense Authorization Act. When fully implemented, the PMA will enable the Space Force to create a new model of service, integrating active component guardians and Air Force reservists in space-focused fields under a unified service that offers full and part-time service options. General Chance Saltzman said it is an important first step towards fully integrating critical space expertise from the reserve into our force. Now, isn't that fascinating? We've been talking, Anons, for a while that the counter-saboteur operations and the counterinsurgency operations that have been taking place within various chains of military command and control encompass both the active duty and the reserve component of forces of the United States Armed Services. And so now we're seeing the Space Force essentially requesting that Air Force reservists coming over from the Air National Guard, or excuse me, coming over from the Air Force Reserve should come into Space Force and consolidate into essentially under one umbrella, under one direction, sort of like having a general manager now taking over the role of two former managers. We've been serving side by side together, said the general, supporting the same mission for longer than Space Force has existed. And I am excited to call the teammates I'm excited to officially call the teammates who decide to transfer guardians. Air Force reservists who hold specialty codes below are eligible to apply for transfer into the Space Force in a full-time capacity. Now, here's where it gets very fascinating. Officer classes, space operations, cyberspace operations, intelligence, developmental engineers, acquisition managers, science officers. Space system operatives on the enlisted side include space system operations, intelligence, imagery analysis, signals intelligence, cryptologic language analyst, network intelligence analysis, targeting analysts, cyber defense operations, spectrum operations technician, and cable and antenna defense operations. And I find that absolutely fascinating because in my research, it very much looks like we're going to see some sort of nationwide blackout event. As a matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, we've already seen releases from U.S. agencies just in the last few days now, coming up towards the holiday, discussing that they themselves are building out workable action plans and policies, one of these agencies being DHS. Workable action plans towards managing a communications and grid work blackout, essentially a national crisis style event here in the United States of America. And so now Space Force has been actively asking for Air Force reservists that are engaged in operations, spectrum operations technicians. So those would be like your telecom technicians, your full spectrum electronic technicians, as well as cable and antenna defense operations. So that's reinforcement for electronic apparatuses and infrastructure that would include transmission and receiving components of the force. We also have cyber defense operators being requested by the Space Force to come into the service under this particular full-time umbrella. And so Lieutenant General John Healy goes on to say, the Space Force is about to integrate some of the most talented space operators under the Air Force Reserve, or excuse me, I have no doubt they will be key to advancing security in the space domain. In time, the Air Force Reserve, like the Air Force, will no longer maintain space ops as career fields, meaning reservists with 13S and 1C6 specialties must transfer to the Space Force in either a full or part-time position, or they will have to retrain under a different Air Force specialty code. Now, this is absolutely compelling because we're seeing the military forces of the United States positioning themselves to sort of head off and absorb, it looks like, some of the things that we've been talking about for quite a while on this show and others, things that the entity online called Q has been letting us know about and has been telling us about. And one of the things that Q has also told us about is that gold will destroy the Federal Reserve Bank. And we have witnessed that process really progressing forward in the worldwide space in recent days and certainly in recent months. Going back to early 2023, we saw a number of significant sized regional banks here in the United States, North American financial system go into FDIC receivership. We now have a situation just a little over 14 months later, after those initial collapses of 2023 began, where the petrodollar worldwide is essentially finished. We now have North American and Asiatic markets that are beginning to splinter with one another. In other words, there is a separation, a forced tearing, if you will, that seems to be occurring in that area, and that is preparing the landscape or opening up the battlefield, if you will, for the Chinese Taiwan campaign and the Chinese Philippines campaign. And it's something that we should talk about here on our file today. The Philippines is sort of like a sub-Saharan African type bastion for various levels of high criminality, drug trafficking, human trafficking, several Philippine islands bearing temples to occult and pagan gods for Aztec-style human sacrifices. And there are significant tunnel systems and underground cavern systems beneath the Philippines that connect all the way across the Pacific Ocean there in that area over towards the mainland of East Asia, as well down towards the island nations to the south and to the south. I believe it's the southwest, if I'm not mistaken on my geography. So one of the things that's very interesting is we should see the financial prepping laid out for the launch of some sort of Asian theater campaign. We saw President Putin just a couple of weeks ago, actually less than a couple of weeks ago, ink an agreement, a very significant alliance, sort of an Axis-style alliance with Pyongyang and leader Premier Kim Jong-un out of Pyongyang. That alliance included the promise essentially to come to one another's aid if military force or if military conflict happened to be breaking out and involving one or the other parties. So it's sort of like a global South version of NATO that's beginning to come into play before our very eyes. We've known for a while that Russia, North Korea, Iran are highlighted by Q as being closed off-book financial systems worldwide. They give a great deal of coverage, again, to that money laundering, black market syndicates around the world. And so a number of things I think are going to come out of that agreement between Putin and Leader Kim, discussing the elimination of certain criminality conditions and certain on-the-ground conditions in both countries for mutually beneficial trade, R&D exchange, technological exchange, and things like that. The technological exchange, to sidebar really quickly on that note, has already begun as North Korea has begun transferring military communication to Russian-hosted satellites, thereby removing the exposure to Seoul, South Korea, U.S. surveillance technology vis-a-vis their hosting currently on Chinese satellites. These satellites from China have been involved and heavily engaged with the U.S. CIA, DARPA, and the Washington, D.C. Military intelligence deep state, just as it has been with the Beijing military intelligence deep state. And so those pathways are very open and very capable of easy surveillance. Russia offers a way to disconnect essentially for North Korea and the North Korean military to have truly secure communications, and that is in preparation again, I believe, for an expansion of conflict on the Korean Peninsula. But none of this can occur until we see the Asiatic trade sector and the North American Asiatic SWIFT system connections to include literal supply chains, but also digital and technological infrastructural supply chains and financial market entanglement. We have to see some of that split apart and torn away. And we're already seeing that happen. An article published just yesterday discussing the Japanese yen is now at a 38-year low. The Japanese yen is down versus the dollar and the U.S. and the euro, and is at a 38-year low, which is a record through Wednesday. And this particular the yen, according to the article, pardon me here, I'm trying to read and go. The Japanese unit continued a downward spiral on Wednesday, with market participants on high alert for Japanese government intervention to boost the currency. Now, what is fascinating about this particular happening is that we know the various fiat currencies that are involved in the propping up and in the underpinning of North American and Western European central bank models around the world. Those currencies will either outright collapse or they will fall significantly in value and enter a period of forced restructuring. And we've seen a lot of that playing out in various what we would call third world or global south nations. But now this process is beginning to enter into that Asian sector. And the Asian sector, I think, provides the conduit, if you will, the back door into eroding what we have here in the form of the central banking system that has overtaken Western Europe and North America, because so much of that Western banking system has been heavily reliant on the suppression of Asian wealth, on the theft and the withholding of the riches of the Asian continent for several centuries now, really hundreds and hundreds of years at this point, as well as the manipulation of those financial systems with their value-less currency. So a large amount of resources coupled with very authoritarian regimes, which are all bought and paid for. Boom, Bob's your uncle. There we have a perfect regime control operation for an entire continental sector of the planet. And that's exactly what we've seen, and that's now being undone. The Japanese yen is heavily involved in North American financial valuation markets because of Japan's involvement in both U.S. medical robotics and U.S. commercial industrial debt, manufacturing debt, things like Mitsubishi, Toyota, Hyundai, and others. Hyundai, of course, being a South Korean company, but the example still applies in the same sense here, where you have the Asiatic extension, really, of that North American Western Swift system, which is now beginning to come undone. This tells me that we're moving right along and that we're actually really at a high pace for rebalancing the world as it pertains to the ability to control money and the ability to assign a correct and real, measurable, transparent standard of value to however we conduct our value exchange. Additionally, one of the things I found very interesting, also dropping today, another article out of Japan, this one by Yuri Kagayama, I believe is this lady's name, discussing a new banknote that has been introduced into the Japanese markets. So Japan issued its first new banknotes in more than 20 years on Wednesday, a yen packed with 3D hologram technology to fight counterfeiting. Now, we know that watermarking, holographing, and things like that, or hologramming, excuse me, have been deployed as fifth generation methodologies to fight counterfeiting, to fight fraud in the balance, to fight fraud in the financial currency and market systems. They've been deployed by several countries, a couple of those countries actually utilizing their military forces in a direct fashion to deploy a holographic currency enforcement technology to essentially get the internal valuation of currencies completely under control. And so for Japan to be experiencing a 38-year low in the yen and yet simultaneously to be introducing a new version of the yen at the same time that they're dumping more than $70 billion of U.S. treasuries, according to reports late last week, I believe, and European treasuries, while continuing to hold Chinese treasury bonds, knowing that the Chinese militarized pursuits in the Pacific will actually, I think, heavily crack and fragment that Japanese and South Korean economic bloc that exists there. This is a compelling showcase, essentially, a compelling example, if you will, a proof, if you will, that we're moving the needle forward in ways that very seriously count towards winning this war very long term. Another way that we're moving that needle forward is through the elimination of organized gang-funded human trafficking and human trafficking that is being carried out by very large transnational gangs which receive foreign funding. We've recently seen a new deployment, a second deployment of a number of hundreds of Kenyan military police and law enforcement, heavily trained civilian law enforcement officers to Haiti in cleanup operations to essentially stabilize and control the country. We also know that Kenya met many times with the Trump State Department and the a couple of times with the Trump State Department and the Trump administration from 2017 to 2020, and that Hussein will seek or claim claim Kenyan citizenship as a means to escape before this process is over. So we're seeing an alliance of sorts built between factions and components of the U.S. government that are loyal to the Patriots and the Kenyan government, which I believe happens to be loyal to its people outside of some of their ministers who are captured Washington, D.C. installed and London installed puppets. An article, again, taken just from today. The arrival of the first contingent of a multinational security support operation has kicked off a new era in Haiti. Haiti is at a critical point with 12,000 Kenyan soldiers holding a population, this coming from Reuters, of course, holding a population of 12 million hostage. An additional 200 Kenyan police arrived in Haiti last week as part of a long-delayed mission to help the national police fight armed gangs which have taken over most of Haiti's capital. This is a humanitarian crisis, etc., that has driven nearly 600,000 from their homes. The full force of law enforcement is set to number over 2,500 in a multinational security coalition, but remains unclear when these may arrive, and funding has lagged far behind requirements. So we're now seeing the government of the sub-Saharan, or excuse me, of the East African nation of Kenya heavily involved in the activities on the ground in Haiti. And again, at the same time that we have a treasonous 44th president of the United States that traces a great deal of important lineage and who knows what else. And that would be something for Anons to go dig on out there. Who knows what else, holding back to, Nairobi and back to Kenya. So that being said, we've seen a number of African coups spawned off by both good and bad actors over the last 12 months or so, seeking to destabilize or maintain control of various component arenas of this warfare campaign that are actually quite important. Sudan is one of them, South Sudan is one of them, Congo, Ghana, Niger, and others, right? And so it is not unlikely. As a matter of fact, I think it would be quite plausible that we see major unrest fomented in Kenya in the coming days. We've seen a destabilization over the last 7 days or so within the country, but major unrest leading to a toppling potentially of the civilian government and the need for the Kenyan military to get involved. I believe that is actually coming, and that's headed our way. And I believe the same is probably also true in different areas around the remainder of the African continent as we go through this process. Somalia, I believe, is yet to come back to the table with respect to the exposure of certain NATO biological terrorism research and certain NATO weapons smuggling that has occurred through Somalia and primarily through their coastal waterways. This is an incredible time where the entire world is coming together to unite against a common criminality, a common beast that has sort of bludgeoned mankind into an attitude of disposition, disarray, and division for a very long time, for far too long. Joe Biden has done a tremendous amount. The Manchurian installation, the military continuity operation that we call Joe Biden, has done a tremendous amount to destroy the legacy not only of the Washington, D.C. Deep state component governmental control force, but also the ability of that central banking system, that U.S. dollar-backed system, and that NATO warlord-protected system from being able to leverage its own enforcement actions and maintain its hegemony going forward. Irreversible damage has been done to economic arenas, military arenas, logistical supply arenas, and certainly with the public trust. This is a period of time that will never again be in history, and I'm extremely excited to be here with all of you. Speaking of Joe Biden, I think we should talk a moment about President Trump's commentary regarding Joe Biden's ability to make it to the gate. We've seen several times over the last couple of years Trump tell us that Joe is no longer with us. Phrases like he's shot, he has no idea where he's at, he has no idea who he is. I don't even know if he knows he's alive. I don't even know he knows what he said. These types of statements and others should be read at a multi-dimensional level because they tell a much greater truth. But I believe that removal that we've all expected, the switcheroo that we highlighted several files back with a potential entry of HRC into the mix, is being set up and is in motion now. As a result of the presidential debate, which was a travesty unlike many others that we've seen as far as the public unveiling of feebleness within the U.S. government is concerned, We saw a coordinated media operation to turn on Joe. As a matter of fact, it even went so far as to elicit the New York Times to write an article titled, "To Serve His Country, Joe Biden Should Leave the Race." A Time magazine article put out a cover in all red with Joe walking away and only one word: panic. I believe it is likely that we see Joe's removal in the form of a medical fitness declaration, a medical removal from office, and a requirement that he step down. I think that's likely to come through a 25th Amendment action. How that plays out beyond there, I couldn't say, except to say that we have video evidence from Columbia University, heavily prepared in a compelling fashion, to show that Hillary Clinton is likely going to end up as the nominee against Donald Trump before this process is over. We are living through a remarkable and amazing time. We have yet some conflict left before us. Russian activities in Ukraine are not slowing down but ramping up. We've talked about the need to destroy certain satanic structures that function as massive frequency manipulation weapons here in the world before this journey can be fully completed. The removal of deep military hidey holes, off-book paramilitary forces, biological terror and chemical terrorism agents, and the purging of ancient and very, very evil cavern and chasm systems must be allowed to play out so that humanity can move forward together. We do have a promised land before us, but it is one that requires the work of our hands, the focus of our attention, and the trust in who we are and in our God to get there. There is a massive attack, I believe, that is going to be headed to the Syrian countryside in Damascus before this process is over. We've recently seen a number of news reports coming out citing Israel's intersectional conflicts in Syria, along with the Iranian presence in Syria, which is well known, Hezbollah's presence in Syria, Islamic State's presence in Syria, which is essentially just a puppet front for the US CIA and the US State Department deep state funding operations. Much of this is headquartered operationally and intersects through the Damascus networks and the Damascus city, what remains of the city of Damascus. And I believe this attack will actually draw Turkey into the war. Iran and Israel are already at war, fighting a bit of a proxy war through paramilitary forces, but supplying one another on both sides nonetheless. When we talk about Israel, again, we're not talking about the Jewish people, we're talking about the Jewish government, the government out of Tel Aviv, which seems to have no interest in the longevity of its own people or those around it. Turkey represents the largest standing army in the Middle East and the only Middle East member of NATO. Turkey is also aligned right now with the BRICS alliance and is working through their joining and ascension process into that alliance. Once that is successfully completed, we will have all of the disconnect needed from NATO for Turkey to operate of its own accord, well-armed, well-equipped, well-funded. This process is going to bring an extreme amount of strain to the Middle East and will forever destroy the petrodollar. We will see a reserve currency perhaps introduced as a result of the BRICS nations, perhaps introduced through a multi-angular, multi-dimensional value system worldwide. But single currency hegemony is coming to an end. A rebalancing of the markets, of the military powers, and a dragging out of the military intelligence and deep state communities in all nations everywhere is accelerating and is only going to get more exciting from here. Pay close attention to the events in coming days. Watch Walmart. Watch Boeing. Watch the actions of Western European governments. Watch the actions between Russia, Iran, and Venezuela. Recall that Serbia, Iran, Venezuela, and a number of Caribbean islands played IP server host to a number of different addresses which illegally accessed the U.S. election system in November of 2020. We will see exposure of this and a dragging out in these areas come before this journey will conclude. Stay sharp, Patriots. They're cornered. We are unstoppable. We will get there. Happy Independence Day to each of you. I look forward to coming back with all of you again soon. Enjoy the sky, enjoy the sun, enjoy the smell of sunscreen, children laughing, the sound of children laughing, and the taste of wonderful food today. It's going to be a great ride from here until the end. Stay safe, everyone. I'll be back with each of you soon. This is SG Anon. Thanks. Bye-bye.